Get up, I sit down, get up, I sit down, get up, I sit down, get up. I sit down and get, I sit down and get, sit down, I sit down, I sit down, get, I sit down and get, I sit down and get, I sit down and get up, 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 I sit down, I 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 get up, I sit down and I get up, I sit down and I get up, I sit down and I get up, I sit down, 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 I get up, I sit down and 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 get up, and I sit down and get up, and I sit down, I get up, 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 I sit down, I get up. I sit down, I get up, 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 I sit down and I get up, I sit down and I get up, I sit down, I get up, I sit down and 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 I get up. And I sit down and I get up, 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 and I sit down and I get up, and I sit down and I get up, 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 and 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 I sit down and I get up.
Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Lannen. I'm French. In keeping with the format, I will describe myself. My skin is white. I have long grey hair. Today I am wearing black clothing, loose trousers and loose top, clothes I normally wear for studio practice and movement improvisation. I am 44. I moved to this country when I was 18. I came on my own to escape poor family relations. I came with no plan, and here I am. My presence here is made possible by lots of people, chance encounters, lots of conversations. Although they are not all here, I invite you through this presentation today to invoke their presence with me. So I will be introducing my practice research PhD, performing the Haptic Maternal. Today I will focus my presentation on the radical dance form that emerged from the project Somato-Intersectionalism, which I locate in the genealogy of movement and resistant practices. I refer specifically Steve Paxton's theoretically informed methodology, namely his research into mother-child touch communication that would give rise to contact improvisation, and ask, what constitutes the maternal in the 21st century? How might a fresh reconception of mother-child haptics inform new dialogical modes and aesthetics that our times call for in dance and beyond? How can postmodern choreography incorporate the radical social shifts and conflicts of our time and develop new post-safe practices and ethics anchored in 21st century forms and embodiments? In trying to answer other questions arise, Paxton's questions of 1972, I quote, "What does a body do to survive?" End quote. What does the body need? What do we see when we look at dance, the other's creative movement? How to refresh seeing? What happens when we, researcher practitioners, invite touch from beyond our hegemonic bubble? How do dialogical processes potentially move and transform the body's relationship to its own experience? How does touch lubricate dialogue and perform the lived body and its sense of knowing? When does performance start and end? Or as Caroline Berval puts it, where does a text start? Where does it not end? So I'd like to start my presentation by sharing with you the story of this practice research and let you in on its somewhat unorthodox orientation and ethics. When I started this PhD 4 years ago, I planned to explore theoretically and somatically the maternal body and experience via my own body as material, a sample of which you have experienced when you came in. This did not happen. My research and the complex socio-political context in which it grew came to trigger what I would define as a series of improvised and reflexive responses and decisions on my part, which in turn shaped the orientation, methodology, and aesthetics of the project. It became clear early on that the deep chasms emanating from maternal discourse within feminism since the 70s endured in contemporary maternal performance research and through its platforming. New leaders struggled to mediate the hegemonic voice of the predominantly white middle-class cis biological mother and meaningfully address issues around racial exclusion and the new phenomenon of trans identity. These tensions leave the midst a newly divided and hostile social and political landscape. The xenophobic and racist backlash of the Brexit campaign and referendum, May and Johnson's anti-immigration policies and aggressive spending cuts, the Windrush scandal, the rise of extreme right movements across Europe, Trump and Bolsonaro's elections, reciprocal acts of terrorism between global South and North, the demonization of Muslims, particularly mothers, violent polemics around trans access to women's only spaces, the murder of George Floyd in 2020, which forced the UK to confront its own track record of institutional racism, and the growing collapse of our ecosystem, which the COVID pandemic exposed all too clearly. Meanwhile, in dance and somatics, the discipline's introspective sensorial orientation proved today to lack social and political grounding, which led to widespread inequalities and exclusion in academia and on stage. A chance encounter somewhere around London Bridge led me to the queer aesthetics of choreographer Antonia Livingstone and her school Male Breastfeeding. Male breastfeeding contrasted with other somatic practices in that it offered a radical response to our increasingly precarious times. In fact, it was a direct response to Paul B. Preciado's counter-sexual manifesto. Livingstone writes that male breastfeeding takes the act of breastfeeding as a healing practice and a model of radical tenderness and codependency queerly redistributed. Performers of male breastfeeding are members of the public, people from often starkly different backgrounds, be it religious, sexuality, and politics. So, for example, on the first photograph in the far right, you have a Trump supporter holding and later breastfeeding a gay man. Their commonality beside their gender is that they either haven't experienced touch in a very long time or they fear it. Male breastfeeding queers and democratizes a fiercely protected territory, traditionally ring-fenced to the cis female body and organs, its practice of intimacy and aesthetic language. When I attended the performance in 2018 in Berlin, I found that the shared erotic event unfolding between bodies was resoundingly marked by its quiet, autonomous processes within, a holding and contemplative practice that naturally displays invisible, unspoken processes of transmission at hormonal, liquid, and fantasy level, and simultaneously turns upon itself to expose one's uncomfortable solitude. It was clear that Livingstone's proposition bypasses some performers and audience alike. Male breastfeeding seemed to grapple with something that eludes maternal performance language, which I wanted to explore and give form to in my own project. That quiet internal struggle, negotiation, and dialogue across another's body. This somatic research, together with our unmissably hostile social-political landscape, came to orient my project towards different questions and bodily movements, namely a search for grounding and connection. These movements are not alien to maternal experience. In fact, my search for grounding and desire to draw connections out there and differently coincided with my two boys becoming teens. Indeed, the fast physiological development of children demands of primary carers to continuously grieve and negotiate in tension the loss of what was, for example, the early symbiotic and intense skin-to-skin relationship, and the desire to construct otherwise, again and again, with creativity, sensitivity, faith, and hope, and intimacy with child. It's a necessary process towards individuation or separation, enabled, I suggest, by the insertion and protection of distance that makes space for the child's growing autonomy, confidence, and freedom. This movement, I put to you, is dance and dialogue. It speaks of the ethical, a moral, no less embodied capacity that informs touch, its character, form, expression, and its potential to be otherwise. This somatic adjustment and labor, maternal or otherwise, felt relevant to our times as I began to question maternal performance research, methodology, and output. I asked myself, what is meant by inclusivity? How might artist mothers produce meaningful encounters? Who is left out of maternal discourse? What might solidarity look like? What does a sort of cataloging, curation, or choreography of such events and platforms do? What does it not achieve? And to echo Lee Edelman's sentiment, fuck the child. No to the continuing merging of the cis-female gender and care labor towards child, and by extension the future of society and life on Earth. No to the stigmatization of men in relation to childcare. So by 2019, I decided to dislocate myself as researcher choreographer. I realized that I was part of the story, but not its center. I needed to ground and locate the maternal within our complex ecology among wider struggles and disentangle myself from first-person hegemonic maternal narrative and methodology. And so I circulate the call out, inviting collaborations with individuals whose maternal embodiment is different than my own, that of a white, heterosexual, middle-class, cis-female and biological mother, including individuals who have not given birth, do not care for a child, and those whose identity and ways of living is somewhat connected to an imaginary notion of the maternal. The call-out revealed that many more maternal embodiments beside those I had imagined existed. People responded from the UK and US. They also voiced their limited resources. Access, geographies, economics, the scarcity of time itself and ease of usage became significant considerations in devising my methodology. I moved to the remote digital email format and designed a series of somatic invitations or tasks that could be completed autonomously and at my collaborators' convenience. In turn, my collaborators would orientate the form, aesthetics, and output of this project towards performance writing, accompanied by photos, videos, audio work, and sound images. A choice that compelled me to value and embrace the potential transdisciplinarity of dance and choreography. Performance writing opens up my practice, and simultaneously, quoting Lepeke, probes and complicates how dance and its choreography comes into presence and where it establishes its ground of being. This methodology generated an unexpected phenomenon which I named somato-intersectionality. SI is a very 21st century story that reflects our ways of living and everyday technology. SI is a dialogical flow of transmission and exchange between collaborator and I, spurred on by the project's remote and digital choreography. This flow is bidirectional and porous. It necessarily generates residue, the play of affects and effect. It is therefore tactile and generative of movement. These haptics, I argue, are rooted in maternal relationality, as reconceptualized by contemporary feminist scholars Baretza, Irigari, Ettinger, and constitute a contact practice which are aligned to Paxton contact improvisation. However, here touch is redefined as, quoting Baretza, a connection characterized by neither separation nor fusion, end quote. Neither complete distance nor full contact, epitomized by skin to skin. Neither sameness, total assimilation, nor otherness with its assigned threat. Here, touch is the indeterminate distance and invisible materials between us. SI is an attempt at tracking and tracing the movements and rich seepages across, and at stimulating the body's reflexive muscles in regard to what is an intensely political and complex territory, that of relationality. So the thesis focuses on 3 individuals. At the time of completion, they are Amaya, a Spanish cis woman working as a nanny and based in London. We are extremely fortunate today that Amaya is with us and will be joining me here to read an extract of her beautiful writing. Iman, a non-binary gay cis man who decides to gestate, also Spanish and based in the UK. And Chloe, a British woman of Chinese descent, marked trans. All are artists engaged in a fine art or theatre practice. None of them have children. Each collaboration is presented as a situation for improvisation. The choreographic score consists of 5 invitations that focus on the maternal body, maternal time, maternal space, maternal being with, and a maternal manifesto. I also use direct emails to further orient the attention of my collaborators. The score is open, undetermined, and the performances knowingly transient and incomplete. So I would like to invite Amaya, please, to join me and read an extract of her writing. Is that okay?
This maternal seems to live within me. It is my body itself. It is me. It goes beyond the outer experience of my physical body. It is spread over my tissues, muscles, bones, organs, and liquid parts of my body. It shapes how I move and how I relate. It has a shape, a form, a body that flows and adjusts. It gives me an identity, a physicality that tells my story, tells who I am, and probably how I am. It goes deep all the way to the cells. I sometimes question where it originates. It's the way I move and live in the world, the way I encounter others, and the way I pass information. It goes beyond that idea of being a mother. At times, it's a woman, and at times, it doesn't understand this idea of gender. My body does not find any similarities to conventional ideas around the maternal, and at times struggles with the outer experience imposed by society. At times, I find myself having a maternal body that is more maternal than a woman who has given birth. At times, this can be understood, and at times, this seems insane. Alienation comes from experiencing the maternal as a tool for survival, a skill for jobs, where the task was to look after children. However, the task was not as simple and came with many implications alongside childcare, such as transference and counter-transference of emotional material happening in the relationship with the adults of that family. Maternal time then becomes robotic, plastic, and at times static. I suffer a transformation in my whole body, in my own self. The maternal time took everything and left me without time, but especially the maternal time detached me from my gender, sexuality, education, and life. It became the time of the maternal, without time, neither space for anything else.
Thank you so much. My collaboration and dialogue with Amaya zooms in on the parent-nanny relationship, a contact practice led predominantly by the white middle-class mother, and the repeated attacks in the form of constant scrutiny and snide comments that work to alienate Amaya's body. They serve, I argue, to insert distance and neutralize the connection or bond between the children and Amaya, deemed problematic and dangerous to the family. We find that the nanny who was recruited based on her foreignness is racialized and pushed just beyond the parent's horizon in a state to refer Baba of semi-disappearance. These haptics are not accidental. They mirror the practices applied to cross-racial IVF surrogacy, where the problematic intimate contact between fetus and, for example, Indian surrogate is carefully recalibrated, neutralized and erased by commercial agencies, doctors, and the law. Later, Amaya's writing probes Western etiquettes and conventions which we all draw on to hide and self-protect, protect, attack, and devalue. For example, notions of niceness and acceptability, rightfulness, well-intentioned advice by well-intentioned people, sentimentality. They act as, quoting Ahmed, orientation devices. They churn and regurgitate the colonial blueprints of knowledge and maintain inequalities. They are a kind of touch. They are some of the neoliberal soma techniques, quoting Stryker and all, that intervene and perform within the deepest membranes of the body and its psyche, programming, directing its orientation, habits, emotions, choices, its desire and pleasure, in short, all of its movement and freedom of movement. We get caught into reproducing the force of the hegemonic collective, simultaneously Western hierarchy and order.
When I look at my body, at my belly, at my groin, I see a man's body, a penis, testicles, and I wonder how I could fit a womb, a uterus, a vagina in all of that. I don't wish to be a woman. I wish to remain a man, but also become a woman that can have children. I even imagine where could the uterus go, trying to feel inside of me for where a new gap could be opened, shaped. It gets funnily more complicated when I try to decide where the opening for the vagina would go, whether right above my penis or in the perineum. I usually opt for the latter, as it seems more functional. My train of thoughts then usually moves onto how pregnancy would affect my body, or my male body affect pregnancy, since the pelvic structure is different, as are hormonal levels. And my spine would have to change shape. Are men capable of this too? I also face other ideas like men are not ready for pain and bearing such responsibility. Sometimes I feel I'm crazy thinking about all of this. I am infected by this mothering delirium.
In this wonderful section, we witness a dynamic dialogue taking place within Iman across the other. Iman's writing is highly performative and direct. Their touch is visceral, reflective, reflexive, and charmingly DIY-esque. They ask, how could I fit a womb? Iman occupies multiple spatial positions and roles simultaneously. They are at once object and subject, performer, artist, researcher, and surgeon. I look, I see, my body, my groin, I wonder, I fit, I try, I opt. Iman performs auto-experimentation. They reassert and perform autonomy and control over their body and the freedom to auto-manipulate, to touch oneself, to feel, and to know. They draw for us a wild and queer desire, a seductive, contagious, intoxicating, and ecstatic lunacy. In the next section, their attention moves seamlessly, an instance of agility and virtuosity. From touching upon madness to childhood memory, everyday homophobic articulations that surrounded Iman growing up. For example, being told that all gays are really women. This experience has complicated the legitimacy of their desire to gestate, they write. Was it truly theirs, or the logic and prejudice of others they were performing? They report confusion, things being really fussy in my head, a kind of cloud I can't see through clearly, even gender dysphoria and integrated homophobia. In Task 2, Iman zooms in further, connecting the current restrictions on womb transplant for trans women and cis men to LGBTQ's enduring struggle towards equality. Time seemingly collapses. Like an improvised act or decision, the past is called upon and inserts itself in the present. A difficult process that nonetheless enlarges one's seeing, transforming one's tactile reach, awareness, and dimension. This temporal collapse could be said to somatically dislocate or displace Iman. What other space might they inhabit? Where to locate embodiment when one is thrown out of time? Are our bodies temporarily suspended, waiting or transiting in dialogical processes, I ask? So I would like to invite you to take a couple of minutes to read Chloe's piece. My collaboration with Chloe presented me with a puzzle. Chloe's performance writing eludes all signs of marginalization. Chloe performs instead normativity, questions and concerns that all cis women of reproductive age contend with when thinking about starting a family. For example, it's an important decision. The clock is ticking. Can we afford it? When probed, Chloe immediately stresses how challenging my questions are to her as a trans woman and to many in her community. She works to redirect attention away from the body, to resist othering herself. While addressing my questions generously, Chloe grows almost immediately wary of, frustrated, and angered by them until finally all rapport breaks down. She writes, "To ask exactly what the problem is not answerable. Perhaps your expectations are something that is interesting to look into." The interaction left me with questions which stuck and lingered and called for my attention. Did I confuse probing and prodding? This jarring and the struggle that followed, however, proved to be hugely generative. The dynamics that emerged put into question my positionality, the ethics of the project, and my own as researcher. Chloe responded to my probing, my attempt to manipulate and orientate her attention by probing back, manipulating and orientating mine. She levels with me and pushes back. It feels that she cannot bear or trust my touch. Her improvised movement instantly, not in reiteration, shifts and resituates both our positionalities and reframes the project, raising questions such as how to even begin dialogue? What movements or shifts must be danced for two beings to enter into contact, in other words, to meet? Can you remember an instance of alienation where language was falling short of expressing your experience? What did you mean that language could not grasp? Did you take the time to find out? How long was your search? What role does time play in touch, and more specifically in meeting? What is the extent and usefulness of synchronicity and asynchronicity in dialogue? My collaborators' embodiments and our interaction have demanded of me as researcher to confront and give up habits and attachment to habits. For example, the centrality and reproductive power that I unwittingly draw from as a white biological mother and feminist. If my body is a typical face of mainstream feminism, including that of the trans-exclusionary radical feminist, essentialism, with its focus on sex and biology to explain inequalities, harms women everywhere, and quoting Olufemi, TERF ideology, in their obsession with genitalia and the penis as symbol of violence, also hurts men. Chloe's resistance and our collaboration breakdown brought to the fore the unwittingly imperialist and neo-extractivist, to quote de Souza, orientation of my project, a one-size-fits-all and a particular economy of research reflecting the wider economy of academia as other people's creative work and voices become artifacts organized and folded into another person's academic project. Choreographer Antonia Livingstone asked me, how does the artist benefit? How are resources shared equitably in that process? Giving up attachments means resisting the symbiotic fiction of unity and wholeness, of smooth, uninterrupted transmission, the totalizing imperialist dream, and the denial of diversity in language, knowledge, and epistemology. It means taking stock of the inequalities and injustice that nourish my and our identities and asking what remains of it. What remains of me or you when we refuse to be complicit? What becomes? So, how to touch across different somatic practices and ethics? This project redefines our human condition as plural and ambivalent social intimacy and interconnectedness, somewhat unchosen and involuntary, that exists within the field of autonomy and vice versa. One that complicates the ideological principles of individualism based on the fantasy that the child is at the center of the world, which requires the violent defacement of the maternal figure, but also ideologies of oneness, unity with its tropes of intense connectedness, of symbiosis with nature and each other, based on dated maternalist and essentialist feminist principles. Here, our social dimension, therefore our dialogical situation, precedes us. It begins in gestation, within the viscosity or mucus of the womb. It is a condition of our existence, always already deeply weaved with one another, yet separate. Indeed, we are always already in contact, touching across distance, be it spatial or psychic. The personal is not just political, it interacts dynamically and shapes the relational structure of the collective and the world, its meshing and textures. It shapes and determines others' access to human rights, their freedom of movement. It shapes their own dance and the dire state of our environment. This direct, yet indirect, ambivalent, almost silent and misvalued global social intimacy and connectedness, although recently laid bare by the Black Lives Matter movement and the COVID pandemic, recalls the ambivalent territory of the maternal as drawn by Baretza. Like the world around us, it is that which happens without you. Kristeva writes about maternity, it happens, but I'm not there. It exposes that agency rests on two choreographic decisions: to break out of inertia, to be in dialogue, but first to perceive ourselves to already be in dialogue. Indeed, me and my collaborators, you and I, were always already touching and in relation, albeit outside our field of consciousness, our field of vision and horizon. What does that do to know oneself always already touching and acknowledge one's ambivalence in relation to it, to let oneself feel the dense, sticky complexity of that rapport? In my project, it means putting my ego at risk or quoting Kristeva on trial by inviting difference and touch from beyond my hegemonic bubble, committing to a lifelong labor and struggle of deconstructing my senses, emotions, and desire, all that go unquestioned, not as a navel-gazing, non-reproductive therapeutic exercise, but in order to inform dialogue and action. It means not just making space, but quoting Rohana Mitra, giving up space. It means stepping up to challenge others' conception and sense of self, to lubricate change. It means entering the dialogical field to find that our bodies are instantly imbricated with one another and our unique biographies because they already were. It means entering the field of viscosity. Our bodies become sticky. We stick to everything and each other. This invisible material that at times encumbers, impairs, slows down, and at times lubricates, generates a somato-intersectionalism between us. It is, to borrow from American theorist and transactivist Susan Stryker, a movement across a socially imposed boundary away from an unchosen starting place. Somato-intersectionalism is how the dialogical throws us and our conception of self into the discursive field, the field of aesthetics and reflexivity, therefore ethics, performing its means disruption, interruption, reorientation, and maybe even collapse. It is how we individually and collectively enter a state of ambivalence, fight the urge to flee, to self-protect, and choose to remain and bear in a way that feels at times uncomfortable, threatening and disorientating to continue to invite dialogue. In 1972, Paxton asked, what does the body do to survive? I suggest that this is a post-safe practice and ethics that our times call for and might very well save us. This is a tactile dance that this project performs, a new relation to the other as a sharing indifference that returns us to an embodied, fleshy, sticky, complex subjectivity and energy and sense of unknowing. So here we are in the frame of academia. Let us practice reflexivity willfully, passionately and stubbornly to begin to open ourselves up to the unexpected. As my dear friend and scholar Roger Smith once told me, in the tension is where the creative response may lie. Thank you very much.
we're not going